I do have a clock here that tells me that I should stop at 45 minutes. I also want to say in advance, this is not your normal academic paper. It's kind of a memoir. Memoir might be too formal a word or too impressive a word for what I try to do, but I just thought I'd try my hand at this kind of work. It is looking backward, but also has something to say about the center. Beyond Secular Reason and Back Again, a memoir in theory and practice. In the fall of 1998, during the plotting and scheming phase of starting the center, David Solomon and I had a discussion about its name. David preferred the Notre Dame Center for Ethics and Culture. I wanted the Notre Dame Center for Christianity, Ethics and Culture. David argued that the name should make clear that the work of the center would be based on reason. I argued that the name should convey that it would be a reason shaped by faith, if it was right reason at all. David did not want theologians, especially moral theologians, to play a central decisive role in the center. He was wary of their woolly thinking, their bad arguments, their routine questioning of church teaching, their tendency to get all warm and fuzzy with the culture. I was wary of the philosophers ruling the roost, too abstract in their reasoning, I maintained, too inaccessible to students, too often dismissive of sources that truly inspire and give a full vision of the Catholic intellectual life, the scriptures, the sacraments, the saints, patristic thinkers, saints and martyrs. David wanted to guard against marginalization, against the work of the center confining itself to religious matters only, would weaken its impact on the culture and thus fall short of Pope Paul II's vision of countering the culture of death and cultivating the gospel of life. I was concerned to guard against secularization, against the dissipation, even disappearance of the Christian worldview, which was already rapidly underway in the university at large, and has been ever since, which would be hard to resist at the center if it were guided by reason alone, unaided by faith. It was a discussion, indeed an argument, on the relationship of faith and reason and how it should have bearing on the name of the center and the mission it undertakes. Now, 13 years later, it is clear that David Solomon won that argument. The center became the Notre Dame Center for Ethics and Culture. No Christianity in the name. Moreover, it turns out that many of my fears were unwarranted. The center has not prevented theologians from key roles there, especially in regard to conference speakers and fellows, nor has it become a vehicle for secularization. Indeed, the center has, by all accounts, at least all the accounts that matter, stoutly resisted the dynamics of secularization that continue to encroach on the university and society at large. As a result of these clear strengths of the center and of the intellectual activity it sponsors and my own thinking, I have revised my view, relation of faith and reason. And in this paper this morning, I want to recount that change in my thinking. It comes in two parts. First, an explanation of my view 13 years ago, that faith calls us to go, quote, beyond secular reason, to use John Milbank's phrase. And second, an explanation of my current view that we need to go back to secular reason in order to counter secularization, and that trying to go beyond it actually renders us far more vulnerable to the dynamics of secularization than taking on the more modest task of trying to reason rightly about secular things. I should say that my explanations come in the form of a narrative of what led me to this secular reason view, to change it from 13 years ago. And it's a narrative not only in theory but practice. Big part of it, beyond secular reason. It's in two parts, basically. Beyond Secular Reason is the subtitle to John Milbank's sweeping, complex, and controversial book, Theology and Social Theory, published in 1990. I read it in manuscript form. Literally, it was handwritten. In the fall of 1989, my first semester as a PhD student at university in a seminar run by Stanley Hauerwas. The seminar itself focused on Alistair McIntyre's recently delivered Gifford Lectures, 3 rival versions of moral inquiry, which we also read in manuscript at the beginning of the course. Although it wasn't Alistair's handwriting, it was typed. Then in successive weeks, we read challenges to MacIntyre's argument, explicit ones such as Jeff Stout's Ethics After Babel, or implicit ones such as Stanley Fish's With What Comes Naturally. Milbank's critique of MacIntyre was explicit, a 50-page theological and philosophical critique that deeply influenced me. And I want to go back and explain why. Like many PhD students at Duke, I was drawn to Hauerwas's theology because it combined theoretical astuteness with unabashedly Christian convictions. Unlike many PhD students there, I first encountered Hauerwas a decade prior as a Holy Cross seminarian and MDiv student at Notre Dame. At that time, in the early 80s, the most pressing ethical issue for me was war and peace, particularly conscientious objection to nuclear weapons. Having become active in organizing around these issues, I took a seminar of Hauerwas's on Christian social ethics in America, fall of 1980. We read 5 books by Walter Rauschenbusch, 15 books by Reinhold Niebuhr. This was in Hauerwas's manic stage. It was 2 books a week. Although Niebuhr's books, they kind of like get the same. You kind of get the program after a while. And then 5 books by John Howard Yoder. For most of the course, I was deeply attracted to Niebuhr. But this was a setup. Because Hauerwas wanted us to see that Yoder advances a decisive critique of Niebuhr's political realism and offers instead a far more theologically compelling biblical realism. Yoder, discipleship is an epistemological event. It determines how you see the world and what you see, how we read history, how we know what we know to be true and real as opposed to illusory and false. I still remember when it all became clear to me. I was reading the last chapter in The Politics of Jesus in the floor of Moreau Seminary on the first Sunday of Advent in 1980, where Yoder states that for the Christian, discerning the direction of history is not a matter of cause and effect, but of cross and resurrection. Right then and there, I saw that Niebuhr's appeal, his insistence on the realities of history to justify war and killing, is theologically and ethically false. And this in turn freed me intellectually to embrace the pacifism to which I had already felt called. For the next 2.5 years, I worked through the implications of Yoder's and Hauerwas's position in the field of systematics, liturgy, and sacraments, scripture, church history, and so on, but most importantly, of course, in theological ethics. These were the years that the U.S. Catholic bishops were working on their pastoral letter on war and peace, so the issues were in the air, especially at Notre Dame. It was a great time to be studying pacifism and the just war tradition. I also started a draft counseling center through the Office of Campus Ministry at Notre Dame, a practical pastoral response to the bishop's insistence that young Catholics need to discern their consciences concerning matters of war and peace. The final draft of the pastoral letter, The Challenge of Peace, came in May of 1983, disappointed me. Rather than condemn nuclear deterrence strategy, the bishops gave their, quote, strictly conditioned moral acceptance of the policy. By this point, I could see that the bishops' thinking was shaped by Niebuhr's political realism. And this was not true only of conservative bishops such as John J. O'Connor, but also the liberal bishops such as Joseph Bernardine. Read the journal articles published at the time. It is unmistakable. Both Novak and Hollenbach work out of a Niebuhrian paradigm resulting in a consequentialist ethic. Moreover, moral theologians of a progressivist or revisionist stripe applied their reasoning in sexual ethics to the ethics of deterrence, thus allowing the long-standing mutually assured destruction policy to remain in place. I turned away from the proportionalists not over contraception but over nuclear weapons. I regarded the pacifist position of the so-called peace bishops and peace activists as more theologically coherent, faithful to the gospel. Moreover, I was learning to strengthen this argument by drawing on Catholics exhibiting Yoder and Hauerwas's radical gospel and anti-statist position. People such as Dan Berrigan, Dick McSorley, Gordon Zahn, and Dorothy Day. At the 1983 baccalaureate mass, when I got my MD degree, Father Hesburgh blessed the American flag with holy water after communion, an annual rite, and I walked out. For the next 5 years, I lived and worked in Phoenix, teaching high school, serving as a deacon and priest, and living and working at Andre House, a house of hospitality, as we described it in the Catholic tradition. I also continued in peace witness, you might call it, giving talks at parishes, helping out an occasional CO in the military, and being arrested a few times in protests over nuclear weapons. While I planned on returning to grad school to develop a theological position in keeping with the work I'd taken on. I knew it would involve not only articulating a theological vision of a Dan Berrigan or a Dorothy Day, but also criticizing key figures who had developed what I'd come to call, following Hitler and Hauerwas, a Constantinian or accommodationist social ethic. Here, the most important figure was John Courtney Murray. From my reading at Notre Dame and interacting with theologians and social ethicists there, I was well aware that Murray was regarded as the norm for doing Catholic social ethics in the United States. So much so that departing from his approach along the lines of Yoder and Hauerwas and Catholic radicals such as Dorothy Day was seen as sectarian, that's a big word, sectarian, as contrary to the Catholic tradition. I consider this to be a bogus claim on several counts. For one thing, many of people in communities in the church embodied a life and witness that was far from what Murray envisioned for U.S. Catholics. From the first centuries, the Desert Fathers, the monastics and mendicants in the Middle Ages, exemplars and saints in modern times. Another thing, the followers of Murray could not agree among themselves as how to apply the principles of the natural law when it came to any number of specific issues: war and peace, economic justice, contraception, abortion, and so on. Novak, Newhouse, Weigel on the one hand, Hare, Hollenbeck, Coleman on the other, they all claim the mantle of Murray, all appealed to Murray as their authority, and they're all in deep conflict with each other. And then there was the fact that I knew firsthand that Hauerwas at Notre Dame had his students reading and discussing not only Barth and Wesley, but also Aristotle and Aquinas, the encyclicals, leading interpreters of Aristotle and Aquinas of various types, stripes, Maritain, Gilson, New, Gilman, Gilby, McCabe, and so on. I knew that it would be the same at Duke, and this was confirmed when I arrived on campus to learn that Hauerwas' seminar that first semester would be reading and testing the argument set forth in McIntyre's Gifford lecture, argument that he, McIntyre, would eventually dub mystic Aristotelianism. You certainly can't say that's not Catholic. I found reading three rival versions both challenging and inspiring. Not only did it advance decisive critique of both the encyclopedist and genealogist versions of moral inquiry, but it did so by showing that the Thomist version is more coherent than either, because it embodies and conceptualizes an understanding of rationality that is, to use a phrase that Garvey hates, tradition-dependent. McIntyre, he would say, why don't you just say dependent on the tradition? It's very literally, he's literature-wise, he's very sensitive. McIntyre affirms the particularistic, socially situated nature of rationality and moral inquiry, the theme since his Marxist days. He does so on grounds that are Aristotelian and Augustinian, and thus Thomistic. Moreover, in doing so, he argued that growth in the virtues, the moral virtues, prudence, justice, fortitude, and temperance, requires an acknowledgement of one's inability to attain those without divine assistance, thus without the theological virtues, faith, hope, and love. Here, McIntyre was arguing for the interdependence of the moral and theological virtues, and thus the importance of theology in doing philosophy, for the interrelation of the two. Finally, in the last chapter of the book, McIntyre offered an account of how an Augustinian university could sponsor debates among the three rival versions of moral inquiry within the limits of constrained disagreement. For a Catholic PhD student studying with Hauerwas at Duke, this was very exciting. I set about to write my seminar paper on McIntyre's notion of humility, and it was in this context that I read, absorbed, and contended with the critique of McIntyre advanced by John Milbank, the manuscript chapters we had read in the seminar. Milbank's book, Theology and Social Theory, presents a stunning argument that is at once quite simple and exceedingly complex. The simple part is this: the secular, as a part or space within human life, is constructed, artificial. As Milbank writes at the outset, once there was no secular. The Augustinian notion of seculum, according to Milbank, was originally an interval of time between the Incarnation and the Eschaton. But in the centuries after Augustine, it was transmuted into a separate sphere of life, and at length it became a realm that is removed from the workings of divine grace and providence. This shift marks the advent of modernity for Milbank, and it can be traced to the investiture controversy of the 11th century, when, in order to establish the papal rights to appoint bishops and regulate the clergy, a jurisdiction was demarcated that, ironically, was free of the authority of the church, that being the state. As a result, whole segments of life were conceived eventually without reference to God or the church, without theology. The complex part of Milbank's argument comes in successive chapters in which he shows how modern disciplines, politics, economics, sociology, and so on, emerged as free of all theological substance and without being informed even by theology. This, ironically, allowed these disciplines to function in effect as theologies themselves, as reigning discourses with the power to define the nature and limits of human society and to explain the unfolding of all human history. The typical portrayals of modern human life as unavoidably marked by competition, manipulation, and violence are but a reflection of these secular theologies. Read any history of American religious life and you'll see a theology in it that can be traced back to Perry Miller, who was a Reinhold Niebuhrian. It's just reigned over the discipline, so that all these histories have theologies in them. I mean, that's what Milbank showed us, very powerful. The antidote for Milbank is for Christian theology to shirk its false humility and assert itself once again as the queen of the sciences, the discipline that orders all knowledge according to what we know about human in human society as revealed through the incarnation community of the church. Needless to say, Milbank is a contentious argument, and he doesn't shy away from contending with MacIntyre. His critique is multifaceted, but it boils down to, it seems to me, is this: MacIntyre employs a conception of rationality that is more universal, thus more indebted to the Enlightenment than he admits, more totalizing, therefore. To MacIntyre's claim that rival traditions can adjudicate their conflicts dialectically such that progress to a higher synthesis is consistently made, Milbank counters, this surely is pure Hegelianism, which for him means it reveals a rationalism that obliterates difference and posits an ontology of violence, as in Hegel. This critique was directed at whose justice, which rationality. The Gifford Lectures hadn't been published yet. But when I reread the Gifford Lectures, I thought Milbank had a point. There is a tendency in MacIntyre's argument toward universalized rationality, toward foundationalism, albeit cast dialectically, toward science as the preferred paradigm for progress in rational inquiry, albeit a strongly historicized understanding of science. Moreover, it struck me that Milbank was right to argue that rhetoric, more than dialectics, is the argumentative mode most appropriate to the Christian message. And it also rang true to me that Aristotle's account of virtue and character is more sedentary or sedimentary than most patristic accounts, including Augustine's, what with their Neoplatonic vision of the journey to God. In general, it seemed to me that Milbank captured the sweeping theological vision of Augustine in a way that MacIntyre did not. Without thinking of these matters in an either-or choice, I went in the direction of Milbank's Augustinianism rather than MacIntyre's Thomistic Aristotelianism. It can be misleading to pit these positions against each other, but there are reasons, according to Milbank, for positing alternatives this starkly. Indicated in Milbank's argument for de Lubach's Augustinian Thomism over Rahner's Transcendental Thomism. Rahner locates the site of transcendence as the self, and thus must borrow from elsewhere for social theory, from Marxism, for example, as with liberation theology. By contrast, the former, de Lubac, locates salvation amid an assemblage of Christian beliefs, practices, signs, images, prayers, and so on, thus generating a society, the church, that is itself supernatural, salvific. I found this Augustinian Thomism very attractive, for it provided a strong and, as it were, high ecclesiology, along the lines Hauerwas had indicated, yet it was marked by themes that were unmistakably Catholic, even though Milbank's Anglican. It compelled many of us at Duke to read de Lubac, particularly The Mystery of the Supernatural, where he argues that a primary source of modern secularization was within the Thomist tradition itself, specifically within the works of Cajetan, whose notion of pure nature forged a concept of natural human ends as enclosed within a sphere that is removed from final ends, from God. Here lay a key source of modern atheistic humanism, according to de Lubac, and modern notions of autonomy, one that prefigures the rampant secularism of the 20th century and its attending horrors, all the result of conceiving of humanity without God. I found de Lubac's argument useful for developing the theological aspect of my critique of Murray. Clearly, Murray assumed a two-tier conception of nature and grace, or nature and supernatural, and this made for a political and social theory that makes no substantial theological claims. Of course, such a social theory is well suited for a religiously pluralistic society like the United States, where political aims and principles must be substantive, theologically shaped beliefs and practices. But if de Lubac was right, and I thought he was, then this theory would further secularize political or public life in the United States. In other words, Murray, contrary to his own best intentions, reinforced the secularism he himself tried to resist. First, his endorsement of the United States as, in effect, a providential nation did not so much protect the freedom of the church, as he claimed, but facilitated the subordination of the church to the nation-state, or better yet, the harmonization of Catholicism and America, which I would argue is the same thing. The upshot was that the temporal mission of the church gets absorbed into the purposes of the United States, which, in the Americanist vision, is a divinely established instrument bringing justice, peace, and freedom to all nations. Read George Weigel if you want to see Americanism today. In keeping with this vision, Murray offered an idealized account of U.S. politics characterized by cool, reasoned deliberation, and even a more idealized account of U.S. economic life as having virtually eliminated poverty, he said in the mid-50s. Poverty is eliminated in the United States. Ever since his death in 1967, Murray's Americanist vision has shaped Catholic social ethics in the United States. While his followers are now deeply split between liberals and conservatives, they all share the crucial assumption that their primary task is to provide an for the nation's state. That assumption runs deep in the psyche of American Catholics and emerges out of the deep structure of the discourse of Catholic social ethics in the United States. As I saw it, the best way to counter this assumption, indeed to exorcise it, is to develop a social ethic, a conception of politics and economics that is, so to speak, supernaturalized, directly shaped by theological beliefs, practices, terms, and categories, liturgy, scripture, sacraments, saints. Dorothy Day and the Catholic Worker were, in my mind, the best example of this Christologically and ecclesially shaped social ethic. And it's no coincidence that the most compelling arguments for this approach were put forth by theologians loosely associated with the Catholic Worker, such as Paul Hanley Furphy, Virgil Michael, and John J. an undervalued figure in American Catholic theological history. Each of these theologians called for closer connections between theological beliefs and practices and the traditional concerns of social ethics. For example, economics and the Eucharist, politics and the liturgy. At Duke and during the years after, I aimed at developing and deepening this general perspective in articles, lectures, classes, and it had the advantage of offering a social ethic that people could actually do themselves rather than having to go to Washington, D.C. and work for change. It also had the advantage of being neither liberal nor conservative, which students especially found refreshing. But it's difficult to get on that mentality that thinks that politics and economics in those bipolar terms it's difficult to unthink the necessity of the state in doing social ethics. The best way to do this, I saw, was to avoid the natural law reasoning of and to ground our thinking in the gospel and the church. To insist that, as Hauerwas would put it, the church is a social ethic. Or, as Mill proposed, to move beyond secular reason. Looking back, this is why I was wary of a name for the center that would not include a reference to faith or the church or Christianity, as my proposed title did. Center for Christianity, Ethics, and Culture. But as I've said, I've come to think rather differently about these matters, and I want to turn now to how my thinking has changed and how it is not. So the second part is called It's not as long as the first part either. I should say right away that my thinking has not changed regarding the need to unthink the necessity of the state in achieving social justice. But instead of making that argument on theological grounds backed up by scripture scholars like Yoder and Mackenzie, Wink, Bruderman, and so on, I want to make it on grounds indicated by Alistair MacIntyre and his interpreters, especially Calvin Knight. At first, I read MacIntyre as a way to learn about virtue, narrative, tradition, rationality, and so on. Hauerwas would say that reading MacIntyre's work was a prerequisite for his seminar. And yet, I've long been aware of a deep tension in Hauerwas's thought between Yoder's gospel-based ethic and MacIntyre's natural law ethic, between Jesus and Aristotle. In recent years, I've moved toward MacIntyre's approach. Why? What has led me in this direction? First, there's my experience at the Catholic Worker House in South Bend. In particular, the experience of getting kicked out of our neighborhood by our not-so-friendly neighbors. After providing hospitality to homeless men and women in downtown South Bend for a year, the city, prodded by two well-connected people, one who was on the city council and one who runs a kind of a half-crooked housing foundation here in South Bend, they sent us notices about violating zoning laws. The city threatened us with exorbitant fines. They brought their lawyers to informal meetings with us. We'd like to get together and talk, and they'd bring their lawyers. They got in the way of opening our drop-in center. They blocked it, Our Lady of the Road, and promised to take us to court. The case dragged on for a year in the papers. In the process, I gradually noticed that I and others in our community were making our case to our neighbors, to the city council, to the press, and to the public, not on the basis of the gospel, but on the basis of fairness, equity, justice. In other words, on the basis of the natural law. We were fighting to do the works of mercy, but the issue had less to do with the works of mercy per se, and more to do with the works of mercy in this neighborhood, on this street, in this house. And here a host of non-gospel concerns arose that became very much our concerns. It's important to note that we did not think through our arguments, the community, based on the gospel, and then translate them into terms that then all others can understand. This is how Catholic social ethics wouldn't think about Catholic social ethics, say, public arguments. It's not what we did. Rather, we ourselves thought about the situation in these terms, these kind of common sense natural law terms. The city is bullying us. They're engaged in selective enforcement of zoning laws. They're picking on homeless people. They have it out for Catholics. So those are true. Each of that last one. We had Nicole and Garnett and Rick ready to argue on our loop of the Religious and Institutionalized Persons Act that we were going to win the Supreme Court on this. Each of these points draws on some aspect of the natural law, but they were not really derived from the gospel or deduced from the 10 principles of Catholic social teaching, another way that I hate thinking about Catholic ethics. They just came to us. They made sense to us. Thus, in following Jesus' instruction about performing the works of mercy, we found that work assisted by a mode of practical reasoning that is distinct from the gospel. That mode of reasoning, as I see it, is the work of the natural law within us. As time went on, I began to see this coexistence of the gospel and the natural law in many aspects of our life and work at the Catholic Worker. Purchasing houses in another neighborhood, taking out mortgages. There's a morality to that. Usury, it's St. Aquinas. It's becoming a very relevant teaching, you know, when the markets finally crash, which might be happening next week. Renovating a building for our drop-in center related to dealing with building codes, developing a meals program, dealing with police calls, and so on. All these works flowed from our commitment to do the gospel, but they all required a mode of reasoning that was temporal or secular, having to do with temporal affairs. And it was easy to discuss such matters with people no matter what their religious convictions were. With time, the electricians, plumbers, and other workers would discuss other matters as well: how to run a job site, how to run a good business, the advantages and drawbacks of unions, the future of the city, and so on. I also noticed how talking with guests and volunteers about any number of temporal matters, how we did this: buying and preparing food, raising and educating children, caring for the older members of our community, how to save or invest money. All these discussions exhibit coexistence of gospel and natural law reasoning within our community, thus signifying the stability and unavoidability of dealing with temporal affairs and acting for temporal ends. And so it is with all of us in whatever community or state of life we're in, right? Milbank notwithstanding, we are not capable of moving beyond secular reason. The second reason behind my rethinking the nature and place of the secular in our lives has to do with the experience of soldiers and the morality of war. Here, let me recount the story of Camilo Mejia, a staff sergeant in the National Guard who became a conscientious objector during the Iraq War. The crucial moment in his decision came when his unit was on patrol in Ramadi, and a young boy of 10 years old threw stones at them. The commander, needing to make an example out of the boy, ordered that the boy be taken to headquarters. The boy started crying. The boy's father came running out of the house, begging the commander not to take the boy away. The commander refused, thinking it would set a bad precedent. So the father, knowing this and understanding this, made an example of the boy right there in public in front of the commander, the soldiers in the unit, and the onlookers from the village who had gathered around by this point. He beat the boy severely, crying as he did so. And the tactic worked in that the commander agreed not to take the boy away. But Camilo Mejia was struck by the senselessness and humiliation inflicted on the boy for throwing stones, and on the boy's father, who had to publicly beat his son. He suddenly realized that he could not be a part of this war. His CO claim was rejected because he was not a pacifist. After returning home, I should say first, and then receiving orders from he refused to go. His CO claim was rejected because he's not a pacifist. He believes that some wars can be just and could not rule out participating in such a war. As a result, he was imprisoned for 10 months at Leavenworth. My point is this: Mejia's decision not to return to Iraq, to prison instead, was the natural law working within him. And it was an example of how the natural law calls into question the waging of modern war, much as Christian pacifism does. This occurred to me again as more soldiers, sailors, and airmen questioned the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And it was brought home to me in a particularly poignant way in October of 2007 when Franz Jägerstätter was beatified in Austria. Jägerstätter was a farmer, a husband, father of 3, who, against the advice of his priest and bishop, refused to serve in the Nazi-controlled Austrian military and was beheaded for it on August 9, 1943, the feast day, by the way, of Edith Stein. But he was not, contrary to what some peace activists try to say, a pacifist. He was a just war thinker. He refused to fight for the Nazi regime, but all the evidence suggests he would certainly have fought against it. Here again, the natural law at work in someone resisting unjust warfare. This idea is articulated by authors I use in teaching peace and the morality of war in my classes. John Ford, for example, the Jesuit moral theologian, who wrote a lengthy, methodical, and scathing attack on the Allied policy of obliteration bombing at the end of World War II. Elizabeth Anscombe, who foresaw that policy and challenged it in advance and rebuked Truman for ordering the use of the atom bombs. And Germain Grisey, who condemned nuclear deterrence by the United States and the Soviet Union in the later years of the Cold War. Each of these authors appeals to some version of the natural law, and while they might differ on their account of it theoretically, their position would be validated by what people know about doing good and avoiding evil without having to think or theorizing about it at all. That's a really important point. McInerney got that point across to me over lunch one day when he said, you know, the problem with natural law theorists is it's a theory about what we all know. You know, and in talking about, you know, this kind of common sense thing, you know, to bring up a thing we love to talk about, the vagina monologues, you know, that great debate of a few years ago, and anyway, the president of Notre Dame called a committee and then decided to allow it, right? Ralph, over lunch, said, call a committee? He should have called his mother. That's natural law. You don't need a theory. You don't need a committee. We already know this stuff. What makes people so impressive, Jägerstätter, Mehi, and others, is that what makes them impressive is that war is a difficult case. Because when people stand against its injustices, it is readily and widely taken to be unpatriotic, treasonous, ungrateful to those who have fallen in battle. I say this knowing that it's the day after Veterans Day. This brings up another reason why I have grown in appreciation of secular reason and natural law in recent years. Its effectiveness in resisting the blindness that comes with pledging allegiance to or being co-opted by the modern state. In times of war, the blindness is often such that the nation's military can do no wrong, a confidence that is readily deflated in hindsight. My Lai, or even, you know, this awful case in Oregon now that was just tried. But what is especially of concern to me these days is the blindness that sets in due to one's allegiance explicitly or by implication, not to the state per se, but to a certain political party or political perspective. This has afflicted most religious groups in the United States, many of which have divided over it along the lines of liberal and conservative, like the Baptists, the Methodists, Presbyterians. In recent years, it has set in among Catholics as well. So that now Catholics are often readily referred to, and they refer to themselves as liberal Catholics or conservative Catholics or progressive Catholics or Orthodox, like Orthodox Catholic. It's a redundancy. When national politics intensifies, as it will over the next 12 months, these partisan identities will become so overwhelming that we may well not see evils for what they are. Let me give an example. In the spring of 2009, during the Obama at Notre Dame controversy, Bill McGurn of the Wall Street Journal came to campus courtesy of the center to speak on fostering a pro-life student movement. He spoke of his long-standing commitment to the pro-life cause, dating back to his own student days in the late 70s when he and a student from St. Mary's comprised the entire contingent going to the March on Washington on January 2nd. He also spoke accurately and articulately about the Pope's Evangelium Vitae. I was ready not to make his talk, given his past positions on the U.S. invasion of Iraq and his resume. But I was deeply impressed by his talk. I was moved and inspired. However, at question time, a graduate student asked him about waterboarding. Is it true? The student asked. McGurn dodged the question by stating that this was not the topic of his talk that evening. But the graduate student insisted and was so vociferous that Notre Dame security, under leadership of our past head of student affairs, who used to enforce the rules here, they began to escort him out, this grad student. But before they did, McGurn agreed to answer the question. No, he said, I do not think that waterboarding is torture. And at that moment, I thought, with that answer, he just lost half the people in the room. The half who think, who know, waterboarding is torture, just as surely as he, McGurn, knows that abortion is homicide. We can call this kind knowledge connatural, known by inclination and clarified by reflection on experience through discursive reasoning, to use Maritain. It is the mode of knowledge reflected when a pregnant woman, whether pro-life or pro-choice, exclaims, "My baby's kicking me," rather than, "The fetus is kicking me." Our language. Or when a 45-year-old Marine assigned to Guantanamo Bay thinks of one of the inmates there during a session of, quote, enhanced interrogation, "This kid's my son's age." In his reflections on the Spanish Civil War, George Orwell recalled the day he aimed his rifle as a Republican fighting against Franco and his leaders. The day he aimed his rifle at an enemy just when the enemy dropped his pants to take a pee. Suddenly, Orwell reflected, he was no longer a fascist, but merely a human being. It was a humanizing experience, and I suggest, instance of the co-naturality to which Maritain and other natural thinkers often refer. That Orwell would disagree with that conception of co-naturality is not a problem. One need not subscribe to Thomism, think and act and live, as it were, Thomistically. What these examples, Orwell's and the others, show is the importance of speaking plainly, especially these days, when our political speech is overrun by sound bites, euphemisms, and cliches. Euphemism, inappropriate touching. Think about it. They also show the power of criticizing contemporary U.S. politics on the grounds of reason as well as faith. What I've been driving at is that my experiences in recent years at the Catholic Worker in South Bend, working with conscience objectors to war, and so on, have given me renewed appreciation for MacIntyre's philosophical conception of politics based on reason and natural law. This is important in the field of social ethics because most Catholics criticize a theologically shaped conception of society, such as Hauerwas's and Milbank's and mine, for being fideistic, in other words, for grounding its political and economic vision in faith alone without an accompanying account of how what we know by faith is also known and confirmed by means of reason. In recent years, it has occurred to me that there is more merit to this criticism than I once admitted, which leaves me with the task of showing, not only on the grounds of theology and faith, but on philosophical grounds and grounds of reason, the flaws in mainstream U.S. Catholic ethics. Here's where MacIntyre's philosophy is crucial, because he says that the heart of the problem is that capitalism does not operate in keeping with the common good, but in conflict with it. Moreover, the modern state disguises this fact by creating a false and phony sense of community, our nation, which claims our allegiance, demands us to identify with it, pay for it, if need be to kill and die for it, all in service to a set of bureaucratic institutions controlled by an oligarchy of the rich and powerful at the expense of the unborn, the elderly, the destitute, the working poor, the middle classes. I think this is in the air these days. A social ethic that fails to challenge these destructive dynamics, in fact, reinforces them. What then of the alternative to a politics of the nation state? Here I would again refer to MacIntyre's understanding of politics as based on practices, face-to-face relationships, genuine participation, all in the context of local community, all in keeping with the Thomistic Aristotelian conception of the good, of the common good. A group such as the Catholic Worker fits this description, along with similar movements of mainly Protestant inspiration that have sprouted up in recent years, like the New Monasticism, so on. But other non-faith-based communities also fit the bill. Agrarian farming venture, food co-ops, worker movements, some charter schools, certain neighborhood groups, and so on. Many of these efforts are pursued by those who do not subscribe to traditional Christian beliefs, who have not received the gifts of faith, we may say, and yet their efforts reflect what we know to be true through the exercise of right reason, which then they must be exercising in some way too. Dorothy Day was aware of this when she wrote of our brothers the communists. And so was John the 23rd when he addressed his encyclicals to all men of goodwill. Configuring the proper relation of faith and reason is an ongoing, ceaseless task, aided by what Pope Benedict calls the purification of reason by faith. This is a crucial task for Benedict because in his experience, when the Church fails in this task, the consequence is that it gets absorbed into the life of the nation state. This is what happened to the Church, his Church, during the Nazi regime. This is what he feared about liberation theology in the mid-'80s. And this is what he warned against in the mid-'90s, exercising his role in crafting the encyclicals of John Paul II, especially Veritatis Splendor and Evangelium Vitae. I suppose instructed by those encyclicals and by people like Hauerwas, Yoder, Milbank, and McIntyre, this is what I warned against in my discussion back in the fall of 1998 in naming the center. I like the name now and the mission it has undertaken. It has been an honor to be a part of, especially these annual conferences, which are, let us say, a unique combination of cutting-edge scholarship, subculture Catholicism, young adult jamboree, and a fusion of Notre Dame and Texan Baptist sentimentality. Thanks to David Solomon, the Notre Dame Center for Ethics and Culture has certainly worked, even as it has taken up the task of chiding the university to be true to its name, a move that could easily have brought on its demise. Now, with its new director appointed, it seems that the center will be entering a new phase. For the past year, I've envisioned the conference banquet tonight closing with a rousing chorus of "The Night They Drove Old Dixie Down." Now we're more likely to hear "Happy Days Are Here Again." In any case, I look forward to another fruitful phase of the center's work, which will continue to be, I trust, a work of spiritual and temporal, of faith and reason, of the gospel and properly understood natural law. Thank you.
I really wanted to be able to cut Michael off, but I didn't get the chance. We the last about 20 minutes, I think, for questions, comments, anything. Yeah.
I'm sorry?
Yeah.
My question is just if you could say more how you come to reconsider the specific objectives of Milbank and McIntyre on epistemology. How does he answer the version of foundational?
Oh, that's a good question. Actually, yeah, I asked him about this once, and I hope he's not here. I asked him about this once, and he was kind of dismissive of it. But I read Three Rival Versions a lot, and I don't think that McIntyre has any problem with subscribing to a version of reason which can adjudicate between conflicting traditions. For example, he says we have to heed Aristotle's principle of non-contradiction and so on. Now, of course, Foucault, those guys want to say, I don't have to play by that at all. But then what he argues is that they're self-refuting. You know, like he's got a chapter in Three Rival Versions where Foucault, who starts out as the rebel, ends up giving fancy lectures in France. And, so what he would say is that he can use reason as in two ways. One, to promote and to bring forth his own tradition, Thomism. Also by learning the other traditions as a second language, and then from within that language and conceptions of rationality show how they are in conflict and incoherent, and to show them not only on Thomistic grounds, but to show them on grounds that they themselves must would have to abide by. So in that sense, it's a complex notion of tradition-constituted rationality, but he is for rational exchange between traditions, and that, I mean, that's what he does. I think he did it last night. I had to go to a friend's funeral, so I wasn't able to come. In the Gifford lectures, he says, I'm not sure I can fulfill Adam Gifford's will. these lectures because he had a scientific notion of rationality. But by the end of Three Rival Versions, I think that MacIntyre wants to subscribe to a certain scientific notion of rationality, the kind that has a very deeply sociologically shaped conception of scientific inquiry, a la Thomas Kuhn and Feuerbond, and these kind of historians of science that are committed to historicizing scientific inquiry. So if you take that historicized notion of rationality seriously, then I think MacIntyre would say, yeah, I got no problem talking with other traditions about what I think's wrong with them, and so on. I think he's very committed to that. Does that help?
Yeah. I've never been able to reconcile MacIntyre's tension with the nation state, in the sense that if you read him carefully, he dismisses it, or let's say calls it something that can't embody the common good. It's like buying the telephone company.
Yeah, right.
It's like selling for the telephone company's cabinet.
Right.
On the other hand, it seems like there's something indispensable about modern market economy and the state for MacIntyre. I still think it's necessary. He even praises it sometimes. Like he says, the American Disabilities Act was a great thing, and the nation state did that. So on the one hand, it's blind. It doesn't know anything. It's a managerial kind of apparatus, public interest group. On the other hand, it does sometimes get it right, and it does seem like we depend on it, and it's not going anywhere.
True enough. No, the corporations are taking over.
What do you think of that? Like, how do we negotiate this thing that we're dealing with, which I agree can't embody a common good.
Right. Hauerwas would say the way porcupines make love, very carefully. But there's something to that. I thought about this. I get tripped up on it a lot too. But I think the thing to remember is that the engagement with the state for MacIntyre, I think, has to be some kind of ad hoc engagement. And if you think about it, that's not as unusual as we might think. We like when we say nation state does this or that. That's kind of there's a notion of agency there that I don't think applies, like philosophically, right? Nation states don't do things like that. Yeah, it's not a big person, and that and there's a history of that image of the political body and so on. I think it's a dangerous image, so I think, and this is what I learned down at the Worker. You're right. We deal with it all the time, and some laws are good. We should stop at traffic lights, and it's good to mention the Americans with Disabilities Act. It's good to put the railing here, near the toilet, and not over there where it get. These regulations are good, and if you have disabilities, you know that, and if you are a decent human being, you'd be sympathetic to that. Now, can you do that and not take on the ideology? That's the question. Like, for example, patriotism. Like yesterday, one of my friends, and you hear this, thanks, veterans, for the sacrifice. I don't like that language. Now, I don't know exactly what to do with it, because as someone who's not been to war, and as someone who's critical of the way war is waged, I have to deal with the problem that people have given more for their beliefs than I have given for mine, But on the other hand, I still worry about it. Because, falling in battle does become the seeds for a new ideology. I mean, there's a lot written on how this worked in Germany after World War I. And so I think we have to be very careful of the way we get taken in by these slogans or these patterns of feeling and thought, and the way they structure who we are. And we have to always be dealing with that. But in spiritual life, You're always supposed to be looking at demons and the way they're settling into our souls and telling us that something that's not okay is okay and good. So I feel like there is a sense of this constant discernment, dialectic that has to happen. So I can't give you an in-principled answer. I can give you examples of it practiced well. Yeah. And it's a matter of practical reason. That's what Alistair would say too, I think. Yeah.
This is almost a follow-up to the last question. Is there maybe, and this is speaking as non-American, is there a good way to reconcile being a good Catholic and a good American? Or how should citizens play that? Because again, yes, we're called to be in this world, but not from this world. We're also called to be citizens. We're called to participate in our society. How can we do that?
Yeah. I suppose in being trying to see things for what they are, being clear about them, like I was saying, you know, not trading off torture and abortion. I think not getting captured by all these politics and so on. It's funny, you know, I've thought about this a lot more recently, reading Dorothy Day a little more carefully now that I've kind of rethought this stuff. Dorothy Day talked about the Jeffersonian tradition in the United States, you know, like small farms, small communities, wary of big government and so on.
But he's the president who doubled the size of the...
Right, yeah, right.
Be careful with the...
Yeah, okay. Well, it was mostly farmland back then, although there were some tribes there that there were people lived there, weren't there?
Yeah, imagine that, Mike.
Think about it. Think about it. That's what we forget. And what I want is to have citizens that forget that we're standing on Potawatomi land. And they got trucked out to Oklahoma. And how do we narrate that doesn't obliterate that story? In the way that, again, I read mostly Catholic historians of America, American Catholicism, when they say, J. Dolan, at the founding, everyone was free. Everyone was free. I mean, just a few years before, one of the most treacherous wars in American history in New England against King George and so on. Most horrendous wars. Christians. There's a book on this called The Name of War, and it says that this war had a lot to do with forging American identity in the colonial times. So I want us to be able to be that kind of citizen. A pain in that butt type citizen. You know what I mean? Gadfly. But it's a service, right? Because you're right. Here we have no abiding city. And if we're citizens of heaven, we're going to be, in some sense, our mere presence will be subversive to earthly power.